Good afternoon to Alan and the audience. Good morning to Marty. This is a live European context webinar on national and global consequences of President Trump's legal actions against media in the US and the BBC. The speakers are the US journalist Marty Byrne and the UK journalist Alan Rusbridger. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I curate and moderate European context panels and talks on politics and media in Europe for two Vienna-based institutions, Pulitzer Club Concordia, founded in 1859 and still active, and Forum Journalismus und Medien, a training institution for journalists and media professionals, founded more recently by the city of Vienna. European context events are generously supported by the Austrian Erste Foundation. My co-moderator today is Andi Kaltenbrunner, Austrian media researcher and founder of Medienhaus Wien. Although our speakers do not need an introduction, let me say just a few sentences. Marty Byrne is a Pulitzer-winning US journalist. He was editor-in-chief of the Washington Post from 2012 to 2021. He was previously editor of the Boston Globe. During that period, the Globe coverage of the Boston Catholic sexual abuse scandal earned the Pulitzer Prize. His work was portrayed in the film Spotlight, which won several Academy Awards, and Marty Byrne has led newsrooms to 18 Pulitzer Prizes. Alan Rusbridger is a British journalist and currently editor of Prospect magazine. He is the former head of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and was the editor-in-chief of The Guardian for 20 years. During the last 5 years of his work in The Guardian, he saw the paper breaking many stories, including WikiLeaks, diplomatic cables revelations, the phone hacking story, which saw News International journalist jailed, disclosures about illegal torture, and the Edward Snowden disclosures about mass surveillance. The format is very simple. We shall have half an hour of a moderated conversation followed by Q&A. Let me mention just a few facts, and we start immediately with questions. US President Donald Trump intends to sue the BBC for defamation in Florida over a documentary broadcast during the 2024 presidential campaign, aired as part of the current affair program Panorama. Spliced footage from the president's speech on the 6th of January 2021 gave the impression that he had urged his supporters to storm the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The events that led to the resignation of Director General Tim Davies, Deborah Turner, the chief executive of BBC News. The news about possible legal action against the BBC spread internationally. Whatever internal problems the BBC may have, and it seems to have, it is still an international reference for public broadcasting, and not only. According to the recent Pew Research Center data, 79% of Americans have heard of the BBC News. 21% say they regularly get the news there. President Trump did not start his campaign against the BBC. His first targets were the US media. Marty, I should start with you. You wrote, "I no longer assume that constitutional order will hold in the United States, or that the rule of law will prevail, or that free expression, not just for the press, but for all Americans, will endure." Could you provide an overview of President Trump's threats and legal actions against media outlets and their reactions? Some have succumbed, some have not. Has the coverage changed? Have certain topics been avoided? Could you give us an overall view of what the current situation is? Thank you.
Well, I think that Trump has launched an all-out assault on free expression generally, and the press in particular. This started as he was entering the White House for a second term. He had filed a lawsuit against the network ABC because of an actually inaccurate account, somewhat inaccurate, not meaningfully inaccurate account from one of the anchors at ABC. It was private litigation on his part, but after he won the election, He was clearly using his the threat of presidential power to extract a settlement from ABC, which then agreed to pay him $16 million, which nominally is going to whatever presidential library that he will create. He also then filed a lawsuit against CBS. He had filed a lawsuit also against CBS for a claim that they had misleadingly edited an interview with Kamala Harris, thereby assisting her campaign, and that this constituted uh, under the rules of the regulatory structure that this would be news distortion. At the same time, an allied organization filed a complaint with the FCC. The FCC took up the Federal Communications took up that complaint, and a company by the name of Skydance, owned by the Ellison family, Larry Ellison, one of the richest people in the world, as well as his son, David Ellison, wanted to acquire Paramount. That was held up as the negotiations were underway regarding Trump's private litigation. Ultimately, Paramount agreed to pay Trump another $16 million, and Skydance made a side deal to pay Trump a substantial sum of money as well, and to provide so-called public service advertising, basically supporting causes that he supported. And subsequent to that, of course, the New York Times has been sued by the New York Times for alleged defamation. Other people have as well. Trump has threatened to, and his regulatory chief for communications has threatened to rescind the licenses of television stations that are affiliated with the major networks. So all across the board, in so many different ways, he has launched an attack. Some have succumbed in a sense in that they have agreed to pay him settlements. Um, I'm particularly concerned at CBS that after this deal was struck, that they named a so-called ombudsman for the network. He came from a far right-wing institute who had been and this individual had been very supportive of Trump. And he was now named the ombudsman. He had no experience whatsoever in the news field. And then they named a new editor-in-chief, a woman by the name of Barry Weiss, who had previously worked at the New York Times, but resigned complaining that she was being bullied by far left people of the staff. She started her own news site, which has been very successful. Her primary targets of criticism is the far left, although she is not necessarily in Trump's camp. So we'll have to see how that unfolds there. The rest of the media, I believe, is doing their job for the most part. Every day we see revelatory stories about what's happening in this administration. I admire that. I endorse that. And I support many of those news organizations with subscriptions and memberships and the like. But Trump is continuing to harass the media, in large part with constant vilification, sadistic vilification on his part. And we'll have to see how this unfolds. Also, of course, I'm sure you have in mind that the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, prior to the election, 11 days prior to the election, killed an editorial supporting Kamala Harris, said that the paper would no longer publish endorsements of presidents, which would be a variation from what it had been doing the previous half century. And he, of course, appeared at the inauguration with Trump. He made a deal to acquire Melania Trump's so-called documentary about her life. She's the producer of that documentary, so it will not be independent. They paid $40 million, 3 times the next highest bid, approximately. And then subsequent to that, Amazon agreed to purchase this rights to the television series The Apprentice, in which Trump starred up until 2015 when he entered the political landscape. We don't know what sum of money was paid for that, but in court documents, Trump has said that he gets 50% of the profits of that series. So I assume he'll get 50% of the proceeds of whatever is paid. So that's essentially money in Trump's pocket. And that's the overall picture. Meantime,
It's
the
all about
editorial,
money so far, but
yeah.
have you personally noticed any change in editorial policy? We mentioned
Well,
Washington Post, or are some topics avoided, or have you noticed any change, or those who resisted are still doing their job properly?
well, I think the frontline journalists on the news side are doing their jobs the way they should. At the Washington Post, Bezos has completely changed the opinion pages. The previous editorial page editor resigned when Bezos said that he wanted it to emphasize free markets and personal liberties. Of course, there was nobody there among their columnists who was opposed to personal liberties, but that signaled a change, and they've moved in a sort of libertarian direction, I would say, and they find every opportunity to say something nice about a Trump policy. They do criticize Trump, but it's always, usually their criticisms are paired with, they take a shot at the Democrats at the same time, and what I think is generally false equivalence. The news department is continuing to do a great job with diminished resources, and every day they're doing great stories. So I don't believe Trump has interfered in that, and I don't believe they've refrained from doing any story because of pressure from anyone, for that matter.
Thank you. Alan, President Trump plans to sue, we don't know if he will do it, the BBC for anywhere between 1 and 5 billion, but he has not filed court papers. You wrote, the BBC only has itself to blame for the handling of a serious error in the documentary on Trump, but its demise, as the US media landscape shows, would leave us all far worse off. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, the BBC has been in a terrible mess for the last 3 weeks over this affair. It was a documentary that was transmitted just before the US presidential election. And it was a look at really trying to explain the popularity of that point candidate, Trump. It wasn't a hatchet job on him. It wasn't an aggressive takedown. It was a pretty fair documentary. And in the middle of it, there was a sequence lasting about 15 seconds in which the maker of the documentary essentially said, you remember that day in January when? And they had a little clip of Trump speaking, and their mistake was to splice two sentences that Trump said without indicating that they had been taken from different bits of the speech. So it was an error. It was a journalistically bad error. I asked Bill Keller, the former executive editor of the New York Times, to see the film, which has now been taken down, and his verdict was it was the sort of error that there would be a reprimand in most news organizations. There'd be a note on the file. Now, what happened was that due to internal BBC politics that I won't bore your listeners with, there's a little editorial cabal at the head of the BBC who are supposed to be holding the BBC to account. One of them is appointed by the government, oddly enough, and they held this error up as an example of how the BBC was, in their view, institutionally biased. And when the BBC didn't do anything about it, they went public, and it all exploded into the public about 2 weeks ago in a paper that is traditionally been quite hostile to the BBC. This completely flummoxed the BBC. They didn't know what to do about it. You know, a giant, one of the best, greatest news organizations in the world, was totally silent for about a week. And at the end of that week, the director general, the person who heads this whole £6 billion operation with about 4,000 or 5,000 journalists and the head of news, resigned. And what had been a minor crisis became a complete catastrophe. Trump became aware of these allegations about the editing of his speech, immediately said he was going to sue the BBC for $1 billion, then he upped it to $5 billion. $5 billion would, of course, completely wreck the BBC. You know, that would be 5/6 of its annual revenue. Of course, it's not going to happen. As Marty knows, the US law and the protections that journalists have when broadcasting about public figures. But nevertheless, it was a very aggressive takedown attempt to take down by the president. The White House said that the BBC was, quotes, 100% fake. This glorious news organization was 100% fake news. And since then, there have been resignations of the BBC board, the very prestigious Wreath Lecture, which is given each year by an outsider, this year by a Dutch historian called Bregman. He protested 2 days ago that his speech had been censored because he said during the course of his first lecture that Donald Trump was, in his view, the most openly corrupt president in US history. That sentence was taken out of his lecture. And so you already begin to see how these threats against a mighty institution like the BBC begin to have an effect of self-censorship. That's the background to the BBC story.
Before I ask Andy to come up with follow-up detailed questions, a colleague of mine from Denmark, who used to be the director of the public radio in Denmark, said to me, it is not only about the BBC. BBC is such a reference that I'm afraid it will tarnish the image of other public broadcasters and not only public broadcasters in the rest of Europe. Would you agree with that?
Well, the context is that public broadcasters the world over are under attack. And we know that in particular, authoritarian populist leaders almost inevitably target public service broadcasting because it's generally very trusted. BBC is way more trusted than any newspaper in the UK. And it's universally available. That's the whole point. It's universally available. So there is this fire hose of really good, accurate, trusted journalism. And if you're a populist authoritarian leader, you don't want that. Trump has gone out of his way in both his presidencies to take papers like the New York Times and declare war on them, to try and persuade people that the New York Times is fake. Because if you can persuade people that the best media is fake, then people stop knowing who to trust. They might as well trust President Trump. Big mistake in my view, but that's the deliberate tactic. That unfortunately coincides with the agenda. Well, two different agendas. One is media owners, who of course don't like having a big, powerful media organization, as it were. I mean, in the BBC's case, it's paid for by a special form of tax, but the Murdochs have always attacked the BBC. They call it a state broadcasting organization, and they would dearly love to see it go. They've often said so publicly, so they would like to see it weakened. And then there's a kind of ideological attack on these public service broadcasters, and the Telegraph, which published these revelations, would certainly fall into that camp. And you could see the subjects that they were trying to trip the BBC up on are all the sort of hot wire culture wars issues, immigration, gender issues, political bias in general, decolonization, these kind of issues that they claim the BBC is biased. And the danger is that you get these figures who have an almost arbitrary sense of what constitutes impartiality, and they try and intimidate the BBC by saying you're a left-wing organization, you're woke, you've been captured by liberals, as a sort of deliberate tactic. And it's not helped by the fact that the BBC has 5 members of a 13-member board who are actually appointed by the government. So Boris Johnson appointed, when he was Tory Prime Minister, he appointed the person who's the biggest thorn in the flesh of the BBC at the moment, and who claims the BBC isn't, according to his standards, impartial. So you've got this sort of threefold attack. Your question is that going to spill over? Well, I think every public broadcaster in the world is under a form of this kind of attack. But I think we shouldn't accept the narrative here that the BBC has been tarnished by this. I think that's to fall into the trap of that Trump would like us. Trump would like us to believe that this is a $5 billion era, whereas I think a greater sense of proportion would be to say that this was a mistake. I don't think it's any indication of ideological bias. I think it was a bit of sloppy editing. And you can't let mistakes like this, which happen in all news organizations, be used to tarnish the overall integrity and trust in public service broadcasting. It's ridiculous.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, my question, one first simple question. So, if I understand correctly, almost nobody, Marty, in the US has seen this piece, this documentary, actually, no, because you don't have the BBC iPlayer. So what's the 5 billion damage in that? And wouldn't people understand how ridiculous this legal action would be? Or what's the kind of debate in the UK, and what's the kind of debate, the public opinion on that in some way ridiculous legal action?
Trump is a genius at creating noise. So he throws out this figure of 5 billion, and which has some effect. In the UK, people who don't know about the American libel laws immediately start panicking. But as Marty knows better than anyone else, first of all, he's got to establish that anybody in Florida actually watched this program, because it wasn't available in Florida. So where is the damage to his reputation? And secondly, as Marty knows, there is this doctrine of the New York Times versus Sullivan, a case going back to 1964, which effectively protects reporting on public figures, and there's no more public figure than the US president, unless you can prove that it was done in actual malice, so that whoever edited this film deliberately did so in order to damage the president. And I just don't think it's credible that even if they can prove that anybody actually watched this film in the USA, that they can prove that the BBC did this deliberately. So I think it's a doomed case, but that doesn't stop the noise being successfully generated around it.
Yeah, the numbers are completely fantastical. I mean, when Trump sued ABC, it was for billions of dollars. When he sued CBS, it was for billions of dollars. They settled for $16 million, each one of them. And he's suing the New York Times now for $15 billion. Anything less than $1 billion, he's not gonna sue for. He does do this to get attention. These numbers are absurd. And there are these hurdles, as Alan mentioned, to get over here in the United States. There are specific protections for the coverage of public officials and public figures. It is sort of based in this landmark case of New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, which set the standard that the plaintiff has to prove malice, actual malice. That doesn't mean malice as we understand it. That's a legal term, which means with knowledge that it was false, or with reckless disregard of whether it was false or not. And that in itself requires additional explanation from a judge. So it's all very complicated, and different judges give different instructions. The problem, I think, is there are two issues, perhaps. One is it's in Florida, and that's Trump's favorite venue for bringing cases. He brought a case against the Pulitzer Prize board for reporting by the Washington Post and the New York Times. That case is ongoing, even though I think it's an absurd case. But he brought that in Florida, and when I read the judge's decisions, it's evident to me that they haven't actually looked at the stories. So, but these Florida judges are very much sort of lean toward Trump. So you never know what's going to happen in the lower courts in Florida, as opposed to getting up to the Supreme Court. And secondly, it just takes a lot of time and resources to defend these cases. It can, if they're not immediately dismissed, and people will be called to testify. It's highly distracting. Embarrassing information can come out because of the discovery process of obtaining internal communications, things like that. So, and of course, now in the Supreme Court, we have a much more conservative Supreme Court. Two of the members of that court, Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch, have expressed skepticism about New York Times versus Sullivan, and there may well be other justices who are skeptical of that standard. So the likelihood is that this case won't really go very far, but you never know how this will play out. So that is the risk, I think, for the BBC, is that it could play out for some period of time. And as Alan indicated, I think Trump's threat of a lawsuit has already had an effect. this historian's speech was edited to take out the line that this was the most corrupt U.S. administration in American history. I've said that myself. I just said it. I was just in Spain. I said it multiple times in multiple interviews. And I've said worse. I said it's the most venal, vengeful.
But you probably have $5 billion.
Well, I don't. Just sue me for whatever I have, but what little I have. But I've said that it's the most venal, vengeful, corrupt, and cruel administration in American history. So I went beyond that. To me, that's fair comment about any public official in the United States. It's traditionally been viewed that way. It's my opinion. And so I think that, Trump has already had an impact. He's made them more timid. And I think that's the risk of these lawsuits is that it causes media outlets to start pulling back, to be much more unduly cautious. So we should always be cautious. We should be careful. That's how the BBC made this mistake. And I think actually I should mention that one other problem for the BBC is that it became aware of this mistake and it didn't correct it. And that's frankly, I can't understand that. They should have simply corrected it immediately, and you wouldn't have a case like this if they had done so. So they clearly should have corrected it as soon as they became aware of it. And so, and that doesn't help them in a legal case when they are aware of the mistake and do not do anything to correct it. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I think that legal chances are slim, but you never know in the current environment.
Alan, do you think that other British media, like The Guardian or FT, that have important offices and coverage of the US, will now think twice what they cover and how they cover when it comes to the US or maybe even other countries that can, emulate President Trump or other politicians, I mean?
Well, I think there's an interesting discussion here about ownership. And the one advantage that British papers have are that by and large, they're not owned by people who have commercial interests that Trump can touch. You could argue about Rupert Murdoch, but I think Rupert Murdoch, who is also, by the way, being sued, the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion for publishing, as far as we know, an accurate story about Trump and a greeting that he set Jeffrey Epstein. But I think Murdoch is a different kettle of fish and is not particularly enamored of Trump anyway, and I can't see Murdoch settling. So the ownership of the British papers, the FT is owned by a Japanese company. The Guardian is owned by a trust. It's very difficult to damage their commercial activities in the way that Trump has successfully managed to do with owners in the United States who may have other ambitions. It may not be to do with the paper themselves, but I think in the cases of ABC and CBS, there were commercial considerations in the ownership there. And of course, Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post relies on any administration in connection with his space business and his servers, his Amazon servers business. So it's quite easy for Trump to exercise and bully people who in a sense, need him. You could say the same is true of
state contracts,
the big tech barons on the West Coast. So I think it's an opportunity actually for the British players. The Guardian has a considerable operation in the US at the moment. The FT too, and I would say the BBC to continue to broadcast robustly. The BBC, I was reading just before this latest scandal, is the second most trusted broadcaster in the US now, just behind the Weather Channel. And it's got 70 million listeners or viewers. So, at a time when people don't know who to trust, I think this is a big opportunity for people who are based in the US to show what they're made of.
If I could just interject here, I think the greater threat to foreign journalists in the United States is from proposed new visa requirements from the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security has recently published a proposal that would fix the term for visas for foreign journalists in the United States to only 240 days. Um, and for any representative from China, it would be 90 days. So that is a very short period of time. In the past, um, foreign correspondents here in the United States were able to stay as long as they were employed in this country by their media outlet, and the visas would be routinely renewed. Um, and so what this allows of a limit of 240 days would mean that the administration can closely monitor the coverage of these correspondents here in the United States. And if it's displeased with that coverage, it can simply not renew the visa. And it may not issue a new visa for that particular media outlet. That is a far greater threat, I think, to the work of foreign journalists here in the United States than the lawsuit against the BBC.
Mhm. May I ask you, Marty, what's the public awareness of the state of threats to press freedom, which we are discussing here so openly? But it, do people understand? Is the kind of debate not only the professionals, but well, the public awareness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people are aware. They have very different views necessarily about the press. The press is the level of confidence in the press, approval for the press in the United States has sunk to its lowest level ever in history. It's true that the BBC is among the most trusted news organizations in the United States. Um, it helps that they all speak with a British accent. That's always very much admired here in the United States. They sound much more authoritative just by speaking in a British accent. I'm so impressed with it myself. And 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 of course, it is not based here in the United States, so that helps. Um, the BBC is not really doing investigative journalism here in the United States either, and that's the most polarizing kind of journalism. So, but the public has been the latest that I saw was the New York Times poll that suggested that 60% of the American public felt that Trump had gone too far in his attacks on the press. Something like 70% were opposed to his proposals to rescind the licenses of television stations that are affiliated with the major networks for coverage that he himself just doesn't like or that's critical of him. So, of course, it varies. Actually, among younger people, the support for the press is higher. Among Democrats, it's higher than among Republicans. Um, it's of course concerning that there's still tens of millions of people in the United States who either don't understand the First Amendment to the Constitution or would be happy to live without it. But there's still a strong base of support for free expression generally, and I think under that umbrella, for a free press, even if they don't like the press.
I assume that you would not agree with Alan's British accent when he wrote that the US is in its near collapse into information chaos. He wrote it, so I
I
cannot read
thought that
it.
was I thought that was a very lively turn of phrase. And I'm not sure we're there yet. I mean, it's a bit of a mess at the moment. I don't know whether I'm ready to say chaos. There are reliable sources of information in the United States. The news coverage of the New York Times, the news coverage of the Wall Street Journal, the news coverage of the Washington Post, news coverage of most of the major networks. Is still reliable. There are other reliable sources of information out there, some good, really great magazines and some good influencers and you name it. But we are at a point where people aren't sure whether there's anything that they can trust. We cannot agree on a common set of facts. We can't even agree on how to determine what a fact is, because all of the elements that we have used in the past to determine facts have been devalued and denied and denigrated. So education, expertise, actual evidence, all of that gets denied. Um, and and so we're at a point where, and particularly now with AI, there's a lot of There are a lot of false images that are being circulated, video, still images, false audio that's being circulated. And there is a risk that people will come to the conclusion that you can't distinguish between what's true and what's false. And there's no point even in trying. And so they will become more tribal and just say, yeah, I'll believe whoever appears to represent my interests. So I think we're moving way too fast. Well, at any speed would be too fast, but we're moving at an accelerating pace into that it could be chaos, but I'm not sure we're at chaos just quite yet. So.
Okay, so not yet.
Allow me a final one to Alan before we open for the Q&A. Following up to the public broadcast question, which he explained so well, that all over Europe and in other countries too, we have that real pressure on public broadcast. But even if when the flagship, the BBC, is in in troubled waters, so what's the way out for the BBC? Is there some learnings we can have for the generally for the sector of public broadcast? We have the situation in Germany, in Austria, where we're right now, where there's of course that right-wing parties pressure on there's the financial pressure. Also on the BBC, you wrote that there's governance problems since quite some time in the BBC. Is there a way out? Is there a perspective?
Well, I think Marty just put his finger on it, that the societies that can't agree on facts are doomed, in my view. If there's no common factual basis, if you can't even agree that facts are the things that underpin law, government, science, academia, media, then that is the definition of information chaos, when people can't believe that. And then you have to look at who's in. If you let's say you may waved a magic wand, as indeed Trump has tried to do in getting rid of Voice of America and downplaying the subsidy to National Public Radio, which is the nearest thing that America has to public service media. If you could get rid of public service media altogether, then the question of who owns our conversations, who owns the facts, becomes very pertinent. In the UK at the moment, the Daily Telegraph, which broke the story, has been ownerless for the last 2.5 years because the right people with the right amount of money have not come forward to buy it, although maybe in the last week that's changed. There's a billionaire who has started a broadcasting channel to compete with the BBC, and he predicts that he's going to overtake the BBC in 2029. GB News, which is an avowedly right-wing party, the broadcaster that seems very intent on getting the populists into government next time round in this country. You've got the Murdoch family, but the head of that family is now 94 years old. And then you've got social media, which is in the hands of people like Elon Musk. And I think there's no sane person in the UK that would want Elon Musk in charge of setting the algorithms by which we receive news, or hosting the conversations in which we by which we inform ourselves. Elon Musk has no interest in facts. And his behavior since owning X, in particular, the way that he tries to moderate the British debate and I would say the German debate, supporting far-right outfits. So if you take public service broadcasting and media out of it, who then owns it? And that is why I think any sane politician should realize the importance of a universal basis of reliable news. Just take climate change. If we can agree that climate change is one of the most pressing issues facing mankind today, if you can't even agree that climate change is real or the facts about climate change, then policy making becomes impossible. So if you're a policymaker, you should welcome the fact that there is at least a universally available media organization that is going to take climate change seriously. And it is generally the case that the authoritarian populists try to downplay climate change or deny it altogether. So I think you don't have to think very long before you realize that the public interest in having a source of reliable news is a bit like having a source of reliable air or a source of reliable water. These may not be things that the market can easily produce, but there's an overwhelming case for having that as a form of public service.
Thank you.
I would go ahead with the chat with the question. I just saw the chat what Stepan said, the question going the same direction. What should other European public service media do? But one other question in the beginning of what Stepan from the Czech magazine Respect is asking, was it a wise decision for Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus to resign at this stage?
Well, I think I don't know what went on inside the board. I mean, this is another curious thing when it comes to ownership. But the board of the BBC, which is, by any account, one of the great media journalistic organizations in the world, employs something like 4,000 journalists. And with an economic model that is successful, you pay your tax or you go to jail. Marty would have loved that as a business model for the Washington Post. I would have loved it at the Guardian. So it kind of works, and yet the board, if you look at the makeup of the board, they're largely people drawn from business or finance or law. And so you haven't got people who really understand journalism on that board. And I think what happened was that Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus felt that there was just no support for them. And it's a horrible position to be in, the sort of, the firing line day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, for committing no graver offenses than any of the people who are accusing them. And I think they probably just felt exhausted.
But the board question is a crucial one always. So how come that's something the BBC has a lack of journalistic experience in its board?
I think it's a mistake. People have been playing with the governance of the BBC for years. I mean, I was lucky enough at the Guardian. I reported into an editorial trust who were not allowed. They could fire me, but they weren't allowed to interfere with the whatever the Guardian published. And I think it's important that these great news organizations have people at the top who will protect the editor in a knowledgeable way from attempts to nobble them, frankly. And I suspect Tim Davie felt he wasn't being protected.
I think there is one more question, Andy.
Yeah, from Pavel. Maybe he wants to ask it himself.
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. Sorry, it's quite dark here. All right. Yeah, so my question is concerning the SLAPP legislation. For those, I suppose you're all familiar with this term. It's abbreviation for strategic lawsuit against public persons. And it was the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. She was targeted by SLAPP lawsuits just to harass her. Do you have any? I know it's only indirectly connected to this case of the BBC, but do you have any examples of SLAPP lawsuits in UK or in US right now?
But yeah, it's actually a strategic lawsuit against public participation. So the people who are actually expressing opinions, just doing what would be allowed in any sort of certainly in any democratic society, are being sued for their commentary. There are plenty of lawsuits of that sort. I mean, whether they really qualify as SLAPP lawsuits or not that's to be determined by a court. A number of states in the United States have laws against those kinds of lawsuits, and that is a defense that can be invoked by different news organizations in the United States. But there's no question that many individuals, particularly those who are well-resourced, quite wealthy, are seeing see the opportunity for bringing lawsuits against the press because the press is in a weakened state. They see the press as being very vulnerable and unwilling to take the kinds of risks that it would have taken in the past. And so they are bringing lawsuits as a form of harassment. And that is occurring, I think, throughout the United States, as it is in other countries. And um, and that is a big risk, I think, right now. Uh, Lots of news organizations are facing far more lawsuits than they did before, and it's very costly to defend. And I think some of this is being encouraged by Trump and his allies as a way of just saddling news organizations with immense legal costs, so that they, as just as a form of harassment and also as a form of intimidation, to make sure that they will do what I think the BBC just did, and that is not run certain things, and just be much more timid in their coverage.
Are there any more questions, or shall we ask questions?
One of mine would be, of course, one of the big topics in Austria, Germany, other countries is the competition with the platforms when it comes to news and when it comes to money with Meta and Alphabet. So how's the ecosystem changing in the US recently? How can you see that? And what does it mean for the position of journalism under pressure and also that competition with the big platforms, also big companies financially, of course? What's your
Well,
observation on that?
we're very different from Europe in this respect, I think. In the United States, I believe that the trend has been much more in favor of the tech platforms
Yeah.
under the Trump administration. Trump has been able to enlist the support of the top executives of the tech platforms. They contributed money to his inauguration. They're contributing money to his destruction of the East Wing of the White House and the creation of a mammoth, grotesque ballroom on the site of the White House. Um, they're supporting him in other ways. They themselves, the executives, were exasperated with the Biden administration, with the aggressive antitrust enforcement on the part of the Biden administration, with the leadership of the Federal Communications Commission under Lina Khan, who was very aggressive toward the tech firms. And so they've sort of embraced Trump and his deregulatory agenda, or at least what he calls he deregulates when he wants to and regulates when he wants to. But with regard to the tech platforms, it does appear that with regard to AI, Trump is not going to do anything to interfere. He will allow the tech platforms to do whatever it is essentially they wish without almost any restraint whatsoever. So I think it's going to become even more difficult for traditional news organizations in an environment like that, and maybe even for non-traditional people in the media as well. Because right now, if you do a search, you get an AI response, and people settle for that, and they don't click on a link or anything of that sort. And of course, traffic from social media has collapsed as well. So I would say the trend is almost the opposite of what it is and what I've detected it being in Europe.
Would you like to comment, Alan?
Yeah, I think at the moment, what seems to be happening is that the bigger, more muscular news organizations are reaching private deals with these companies in terms of AI. And you can understand why they would do that. It's another source of revenue at a time when revenue streams are not abundant. It leaves smaller organizations in a very vulnerable position. I mean, I edit a tiny little magazine in the UK, and we can't even get to having a conversation with any of these tech companies, even though they will be using our material because we're just simply too small. So I would favor a legal view that would apply certainly in Europe and hopefully in the US, just to try and sort out the very complex copyright issues behind the scraping of news sites to create a different product, which is then sold on. I think that in the end we'll need a legal view on what where the copyright issues lie, or we have to have a technological response in which we can, as it were, watermark our copy and our content to try and follow it when it is being scraped. But at the moment, it's an unsatisfactory mess in which the bigger players are taking what they can.
Which would need an all European Union position also, which is one of the debates which we do not have yet, I'm afraid.
There is another question in the chat from Roman Gerodimos. He writes, thank you for the fascinating discussion. Apologies, I can't turn camera on. This is Roman Gerodimos, professor at Bournemouth University and columnist for Athens Voice. The Rutger Bergman incident is particularly chilling and possibly unprecedented. The BBC has now apparently told staff that they are not allowed to even quote that line from the Wright lecture, even though they would be clearly relying the view of well-respected public intellectual. What does this mean for the BBC's reputation, and how can other media and commentators raise awareness of such incidents without doing further damage? And also, it's a bit surprising that there isn't more of a pushback or reaction among the British public in the face of Trump's attack against such a national institution. Any thought, Alan?
Well, it's ironic if anybody's been to the BBC office, the rather beautiful office in central London. About 7 years ago, they erected a very large statue to George Orwell, who was a BBC contributor during the Second World War. And on the wall of the BBC, carved into the stone, is Orwell saying, if free speech means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. So all the BBC staff walk past that in the morning into a building that has decided that they don't want to, because Donald Trump doesn't want to hear that he's the most corrupt president in history, they will surrender to him. So it's a bleak moment for the BBC, and it's worrying because Marty and I would agree on this. I'm sure it doesn't matter how great the journalism you're doing is, you need the institutional power of a newspaper or broadcaster to stand behind your story and defend it. Otherwise, the story means nothing. And that for 200 years or more, these great news organizations have been powerful enough to defend journalism. And every time you get a great newspaper or a great broadcaster bending the knee in some way, that undermines the journalism. People were asking, well, why did Tim David resign? Because he felt that the board didn't have his back. And that works all the way down through an organization to the most humble reporter who will feel, if I write the story, are they going to defend it? Are they going to defend me? And the moment that element of doubt starts creeping into an organization, it's kind of deadly.
I have one question. I want to refer to something Marty said, and that is that society that cannot agree on facts is doomed. How do we overcome this? How do we overcome these divisions and agree on facts? Could either of you reply? You, Marty, first. Do you see that this will happen in your lifetime?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm not sure I have an instant answer to that, or a very good answer to that, for that matter. I'm hoping Alan has one in his pocket. Look, I mean, the three things that I say is, first of all, we need to work on strengthening public confidence in the work that we do, and that means that we need to cover everybody in our society to accurately, fairly, empathetically portray their struggles, their aspirations, their expectations, all of that. And I'm not sure we always do a very good job of that. And in fact, I don't think we do, and I think we need to do better at that. Secondly, I think we need to be radically transparent in our coverage. Whenever we cite a court document, we should show that entire court document so that people can read it for themselves and see if we've taken anything out of context. Whenever we talk about a video, we should publish that video, not just an excerpt of the video, but the entire video for the very
Excuse me
same
for
reason.
interrupting you, Marty, but that would assume that people who see, whether read or see, they have endless amount of time to go into all these
Well,
details.
I'm not saying everybody will do this, but if somebody chooses to, we'll give them the opportunity. The message to the public should be, you have the right and you have the opportunity to check our work. And we are giving you that opportunity. If people take it, if they don't take it, fine. If they do take it, at least they have the opportunity, and we're showing that. So, and then the final thing I would say is, that we need to change the way we communicate. The way that people are consuming information is so different from the way that that we traditionally have disseminated information, the way that I grew up in journalism. And we're seeing that other outlets, influencers, YouTubers, podcasters, you name it, that they are proving more popular and more trusted, by the way. And that is because they communicate authenticity, however you define that, but they come across as real and trustworthy. And we in our profession have always focused on authority, which is our highest priority, is the process of verification. And yet we have paid very little attention to authenticity and how we communicate that information. And we have not adapted or embraced sort of the new forms of communication in the way that we should. And so people with less expertise or no expertise are being trusted far more than people in our own institutions. I mean, one of our burdens is that we all work for institutions, and institutions generally are being distrusted, not just the institution of the press, but the institutions of government, of business, of institutional religion, you name it. They're all being distrusted these days. But we have to figure out how to overcome that, and we really have to embrace these new forms of communication. And we need to become expert at short form video, even if we find that distasteful. It doesn't mean we can't do longer form. We can always provide that, but maybe we can provide a tasting menu of what it is we're offering and give people the opportunity to say if they want more, then here's where you can go and get it. People are not going to read 1,000 words or 10,000 words always. They would like it, just a sense of what it's all about. So those are three things that I think we need to do. It's a long-term process. It doesn't mean that it's going to solve things. But my view is let's forget about trying to persuade everybody. That's the other thing, is set reasonable goals. Can we get another 5% to believe our work, to believe in facts? How do we get another 5%? If you get another 5%, at least here in the United States, you change the entire course of the country, given how close our elections are. If we get another 5%, then maybe we work on an additional 5% at that point. At that stage, I would declare victory, because at any one moment in this country, something like 25% of the American public believes the most bizarre conspiracy theories, that the Holocaust was invented or exaggerated, that the 9/11 attacks were a plot of the US government or of Israel, or that we never landed a man on the moon. There are 10% of Americans who, believe it or not, and this is a reliable survey, the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, 10% of American adults believe the earth is flat, and 9% are not sure. So that's almost 20% right there. I wouldn't work on those people. Let's work on the people who are willing and open to evidence. And I do believe that that is at least 5% of the American public, and probably 10%. And so let's set achievable goals.
Thank you. Alan, your thoughts on this, and then we shall have to close. With your British accent, something positive that we can end up with.
Well, I can't improve on Marty's answer, even in a different accent. But I think there is a role for government here. I think actually the British government has just announced that they're going to introduce into the curriculum a form of critical thinking. I think I would start at about the age of 6, when young people, when kids become exposed to the digital universe, so that by the time they're 16, they're able to begin to think about this question of what's true and what isn't true, what's factual, who is telling you stuff, why are they telling you stuff, the nature of sources, how to spot a deep fake, how to verify stuff, because in the end, the scale of the information chaos and the disinformation is so enormous, it's almost beyond regulation. And each individual, I think, has to be trained to do it for themselves.
Well, I do hope that in this 1 hour conversation, we at least inspired the audience to start thinking. I do thank Marty, I thank Alan, and thank you very much, Andy. Would you like to say something?
No, thank you. That was some enlightenment again, and that gave some hope, especially the last remarks that, well, there's a way forward, and that's very pragmatic approach also from Marty. Let's find the 5 or 10% that we can convince what journalism is about and what facts are all about. So, well, thank you for that.
Thank you
Well,
very much.
Thank you for having us.
And Marty, happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and good to see you, Alan, and I'm glad we coordinated our outfits too.
Right,
I think that's really
all
really good.
black.
In black for morning.
Morning. Best to you. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.